Hi, everybody, and welcome to Season 6, the final season of our course and of the show. I'm filming this season under pretty different conditions than the last seasons, my lectures, so I hope that everybody is holding up well, being at home, and that everybody is safe, and we'll do the best we can. Luckily, our class is going to be less affected than almost any other class since we've been online this entire time. Season 6 is really intense, which is nothing less than we expected, of course, given where we've come so far. And it really does tie together a lot of the themes from the whole series. So this should be an intense final module for us. Season 6 is also longer than the other seasons, so make sure that you've left yourself lots of time to watch. And in particular, give yourself some emotional space before you watch episode 15, the second to the last episode, because it's a really difficult episode to watch. We get a new opening credits sequence when we watch season 6. When we see the opening credits, it sets the tone for the entire season. Now the planetarium where Sarah Lynn died is the entire world for Bojack. It's taken over his entire universe. And this is a signal of things to come, because the death of Sarah Lynn and that scene in the planetarium is really going to come to define the narrative arc of this whole season, including what we might think of as Bojack's undoing. More specifically, at the beginning of this season, in episode 1, we see Bojack in a flashback trying to tell the cops that he, in fact, was responsible for Sarah Lynn's death, and nobody will listen to him. This is really crucial considering where the season ends. Remember, later on, he's going to say that he wasn't responsible for her death because he's not the same self anymore. So the self that was responsible is not the same self that exists now. It's not clear at all that he's right about that, and we're going to talk about that a lot. But it's very interesting that the season begins with him trying to take responsibility, and then the whole season is framed by his struggles over whether he is in fact responsible for that death, and other people trying to figure out if he is or isn't responsible for that death. This raises one of the crucial themes for the entire season. If you remember, during the entire show up until now, for the first 5 seasons, one of the central questions has been about identity and the past. And specifically, the question up until now has been, how does our past shape who we are and determine who we are? And within that, in particular, how do our memories shape and determine who we are? And if we don't remember something, is it still us? In season 6, we still get a reflection on the relationship between identity and the past, but the question has changed. The question now is not how does our past shape our identity, but rather, when is our past self the same self as our current self at all? What unifies our past self and our present self? And when does that unity break down so that our past self is no longer our present self? We can think of this season as having 2 main philosophical questions. One is, what makes you the same self or a different self from your past self? And then the second, more actively existential version of that same question is it possible to intentionally reinvent yourself, to intentionally build a new self which is not the same as your past self? Or is it, in contrast, the case that when you try to reinvent yourself and build a new self, all you're doing is engaging in a bad faith rejection of your past self, which you don't really get to do? In other words, when you try to reinvent yourself and build a new self, are you succeeding in building a new self, or are you actually just alienating yourself from yourself and denying responsibility from your past self, which is still really you? There's a third organizing related question of this season, and this one is in common between this season and the past seasons, but it kind of gets a new version here. And that is, when are you responsible for or able to be held accountable for your past acts? In the previous seasons, the version of this that we saw was, when are you in a condition in which you no longer count as responsible for your actions? perhaps because you're drunk or high, or perhaps because you're being coerced, or perhaps because you're driven by addiction or some other need. What kinds of conditions might alleviate your responsibility for your actions? Here, we get a different version of the accountability question, namely, is it ever the case that we want to say that that past self was really not you who did the thing, so you shouldn't be responsible for what your past self did because it wasn't you? Or is there no escape? Are you responsible for your past self no matter how different that past self is? So all three of these questions, the question of what makes you the same self as before, the question of whether you can in fact intentionally create a new self, and the question of whether you're accountable for your past self's actions and when, all three of these get narratively framed and organized this season around Sarah Lynn's death and Bojack's responsibility or lack of responsibility for that death, which is the narrative organizing frame for the season. There's at least two other organizing major themes just for the first half of the season, which I'll call season 6A, because as you know, the season broke in the middle for several months. So it's almost like two mini seasons put together, right? So throughout this module, I'm going to refer to those as 6A and 6B. So in 6A, we see two other really crucial themes. One is rehab and how effective rehab can be. And to tie this back to the organizing questions that I just talked about, one of the questions that we'll see is, can rehab turn you into a new self? When can it fix you? When can't it fix you? And when it does fix you, does it create a new self? That's one question, the questions around rehab. Second theme is capitalism and labor and alienation. This is a topic that I'm going to take up exclusively in the next lecture, so I won't dwell on it very much here. But the question of how capitalism produces alienated labor and harms the self is a question that we're also going to see throughout 6A. But for now, let's talk about rehab and its effectiveness, because that's the 6A specific question that I want to focus on in this lecture. The little Skoblik article that I gave you to read gives a pretty scathing indictment of rehab. And it claims that rehab as a capitalist business model has built an ideology which makes it impossible for its own effectiveness to be disproven. In other words, no matter what the results of rehab are, it makes it look like rehab is not only successful, but the only possible option if you're an addict. And that's because it's built an ideology in which the point of rehab is to work on yourself and your own individual responsibility and to build yourself into a self who can take individual responsibility for your choices. But what this means is when people leave rehab, if they fail and relapse, then that just becomes proof that they didn't in fact do what rehab told them to do. They didn't become an individual who can take responsible for their choices. They didn't work on themselves enough. And if they succeed and don't relapse, then they become proof that rehab did its job and worked. So because rehab puts all of the responsibility for fixing yourself on the individual, any way that it turns out looks like it supports rehab. And this means that rehab has managed to set itself up socially as the only option and the one obviously successful option. Skoblik argues that rehab is just one treatment approach among many, and it's good for some people, it's not good for everybody, but it's essential to the ideology of rehab that it frames itself as an absolute, that it frames itself as a thing that you have to do, and if you don't do it, then you're just not working on yourself hard enough, and if you do it and you still relapse, then you just didn't do it right. It seems pretty clear that the makers of Bojack share some of Skoblik's suspicion. So, for example, she says, if the program doesn't work for you, then you didn't work the program. If you succeed in staying sober, then you did a good job in working the program. Ergo, the program works. The problem is the real world is teeming with temptations, and most people relapse. So what do we do with them? More rehab, because it isn't the rehab that has failed, it's you. And throughout 6A, we see people worried about exactly this paradox, right? the people who work there are pretty upfront that once you leave rehab, you're going to end up in a completely different environment full of temptation, and most people are going to fail. Bojack's counselor says to him that he's special for having actually done the work and being cured. He says, "You've done the work and you're ready. You're a special case, Bojack." This is a really interesting sentence. I'm going to read it again. "You've done the work and you're ready. You're a special case, Bojack." Because on the one hand, he's acknowledging that if Bojack really has been cured by rehab, he's the exception, right? He's a special case, which is as good as acknowledging that rehab doesn't work for most people. But at the same time, he's reaffirming that ideology of rehab that we just talked about, that if Bojack is a special case, it's because he's done the work, which means that all those other people who aren't special cases just haven't worked hard enough and haven't put in the work. I think we can tie this critique of rehab into the critique of capitalism that we're going to focus on more next time, right? As Bojack says, rehab is an industry that profits off of repeat customers. They don't have any motivation for you not to relapse. If there are more addicts out there, then that gives them more customers and it gives them more money. They want to generate people who are going to need to come back. And the way to do that is not to cure them, but to convince them that rehab is the only way to a cure, and that if it failed, it's just that they didn't do enough rehab and they didn't work hard enough, right? A way of putting it in terms of a critique of capitalism in a more focused way is to say addicts are really the raw material that the rehab business needs in order to generate a product, right? They turn addicts into products, and they need more addicts in order to keep profiting. So it's always in their interest as for-profit businesses for there to be lots of addicts. And more specifically, it's always in their interest as a for-profit business for there to be lots of addicts who believe that the reason that they're addicts is just that they need to go back and didn't work hard enough, that it can never be the fault of rehab that they didn't succeed. Oddly, though, for all of this cynicism about rehab, and we see a lot of cynicism here, in the case of Bojack, it seems to be true, right? Despite ongoing temptations throughout the season, Bojack actually is pretty good about not relapsing, and it really does seem like rehab gave him a new self and fixed him. He only relapses once to disastrous effect, right? When Angela in 6B, towards the end of the series, basically directly tries to get him to drink, and she succeeds. A question to keep in mind for later as we work through the more existential issues in this season is when he finally does relapse, when he collapses and has a drink and goes on this drunken bender that undoes him, should we understand this as his true addict self that he's been suppressing coming out? Or should we understand this as Angela intentionally destroying his new real self and making him revert back to a previous self that had gone away? Right? It's not clear what the answer to that question is. As always, the show is very good about maintaining different philosophical options in tension with one another and not giving us a resolution, but those seem to be the two readings. So why is it that Bojack does manage to benefit from rehab, even though he's a special case and most people will relapse? It's not like he has a history of being especially strong-willed. He's really committed to making a whole new identity, right? He's really committed to just getting rid of his past self and building a new self. We see this when he comes out and takes on his new identity as a professor. And it's interesting because we see interesting juxtaposed relationships to rehab at the beginning, at the end. So when he first checks in episode 1, there's that very powerful scene where he refuses to take the selfie with the receptionist. And it very much seems like the reason he doesn't want to take the selfie is because he doesn't want it to be real that this is who he is, right? If he's up on this board, then it's part of his identity. It's literally a selfie, right? It's a snapshot of himself. And he doesn't want to be a self who's in rehab. At the beginning, he's treating this as a necessary but alien episode of his life that he doesn't want to claim as his own. By the end, his position has flipped 180 degrees, right? They're trying to get rid of him. They're trying to tell him that it's time to leave, and he doesn't want to go because the self that he's built in rehab, his rehab self, has become the self that he identifies with. And he wants to distance himself from his self outside of rehab, just as much as at the beginning he wanted to distance himself from his self inside of rehab. Why is it that he's so willing to take on this new self, and that he is willing, once he is thrown out of rehab, to maintain it? It may be, I'd like to suggest, that his genuine hatred of his past self, his self-loathing that we've seen all the way through the series, is part of what makes rehab work for him, right? His absolute disgust at who he is or who he was motivates his willingness to work very hard at maintaining a new self, including his new identity as a professor, as an academic, which he becomes very attached to very fast. And that he associates this with the self he was in rehab and with being sober. And so this actually keeps him sober. But again, and let me just make sure I haven't missed anything that I really want to say here. No, I think we're good. Again here, it's very unclear whether what we're seeing is his creation of a new self, or what we're seeing is a very carefully honed performance that he's using to cover over his old self, and that it takes a lot of work to maintain. Remember, he's an actor, and in season 6B, we get him discussing a lot what it means to be an actor. We'll get to that when the time comes. But for now, just notice his job is performing selves. He tells us this again and again. And so we don't know whether to read this as him just actually turning out to be quite a good actor and performing a new self for a good long time without breaking character, or whether what we're seeing is him building a new self. And indeed, and again, we'll come back to this, in 6B, we get an even more radical suggestion that performances of the self are the only kind of self that there is, so that the breakdown, my two options actually break down as distinct from one another. I had you read Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, a little selection from that, and we'll put off talking about that until we get to 6B. But just to foreshadow, Butler argues that our various identities just are performances all the way down, so there's no distinction between it's being a real identity and a performed identity. And it's interesting to think about what that does, if it's true, to Bojack's unwillingness, or his unwillingness to identify with his past self. And it's also interesting to think about what that does, what that means in terms of the job of an actor. Anyway, this question about whether it's a real self or a performed self, or whether there's a distinction between those, is, I think, the key question for all of season 6, and we're going to keep cycling back to that. All right, I'll end this lecture here, and we'll move on to capitalism in the next lecture.